I am someone that goes by many names, be that Crow, Ghost, Max, whichever, call me any of them. This video is my first video doing properly, and I'm terrified and anxious, and I've recorded this so many times now. But in reality, I'm a wannabe video essayist. At university, I found a love for research and in-depth analysis of things. Like, a good chunk of this shelf here is just theory texts and me getting really overly nerdy about things. I got one of the highest, I think the second highest score in my entire year group when it came to this essay. So, speaking of this essay, this video is going to be a version / adaptation of my equivalent of a dissertation we do in my course. It's called an extended research project. It's only 4,000 words compared to 10,000, but that's because we did an ungodly amount of coursework as well as this. So I hope you enjoy, and that this is good enough that people want to stick around and continue to hear me basically info dump on them about whatever I've decided I'm interested in this week. So without further ado, let's get on with it. I'm gonna go ahead and apologise if you see me looking down in this corner. This is where my laptop is that has my script. My memory isn't always great, and I may occasionally have to double check. Heroes in horror, agency within children's animation. Fairy tales then are not responsible for producing in children fear, or any shape of fear. Fairy tales do not give the children the idea of the evil or the ugly, because that is in the child already, because it's in the world already. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of the boogie. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of the boogie. G.K. Chesterton, 1909. The relationship between children and horror stories has always been a tenuous one. This is seen even more prominently when it comes to mass market media, with some of the most infamous cases of public outrage, such as Seduction of the Innocent, written by Frederick Wetterman in 1954, leading to the establishment of the Comics Code Authority in the same year. These tend to come about due to adults' fears of what the controversial genre will do to the malleable minds of innocent young children. Which is ironic, considering historically children are often the perpetrators and originators of scary stories and monstrous folklore. They are seemingly inexplicably drawn towards this dark genre. In this essay, I argue that animated children's horror empowers target audiences by breaking free from the typical hierarchies of power seen in other films, placing the child characters in heroic positions within their own stories, allowing them to fight their own battles. To do this, I will explore how children's horror differentiates from the genre as a whole, starting with the works of Noel Carroll, Clive Bloom, and Stephen Prince to establish a broader understanding of the genre before refining it using the works of Catherine Lester and Erin Howley, focusing on how the genre is made accessible to younger audiences and palatable to their parents. I will also examine how children are represented on screen, investigating the roles they play within the narrative and the level of agency they are afforded. Additionally, I will explore how adult nostalgia and fear influences these portrayals, drawing on the research of Jane Batkin and Henry Grieux, as well as some additional first-hand research. Finally, I will dive into how children's animated horror empowers the target audience through relatable characters and situations, as well as creating a safe, externalized representations of their own fears in a way that can be easily processed, fulfilling the role played by fairy tales in early development. For this, I refer to the works of Megan Troutman, as well as the established framework of the aforementioned theorists. For this exploration of animated children's horror, I will look at a variety of films and TV shows due to the genre's prominence since the establishment of PG-13 rating in the 1980s. However, my primary focus will be on Gravity Falls, created by Alex Hirsch, as well as Wendell and Wild, written by Jordan Peele and directed by Henry Selick. Although this is a narrow snippet of what animated children's horror has to offer, they exemplify trends seen throughout the genre as a whole. Part 1. Defining horror. Now, before we find ourselves down the rabbit hole, we must first establish what we mean by horror in regards to this essay. Define ourselves a set of parameters to work from going forward, as horror is a vast genre with many small subsections and microcosms that are easy to get lost in. Noel Carroll defines horror as a genre designed to elicit specific reactions within its audience, primarily ones of fear and disgust. These reactions are typically concurrent with a sympathetic main character in regards to a monstrous threat. The audience connects to these characters using them as a barometer as such, to how they should be reacting to the situation presented on screen. Carroll furthers his definition, stating the presence of a non-human monster is necessary for a piece of media to be true horror instead of the many connected but auxiliary genres. Many theorists disagree with Carroll's definition, seeing it simultaneously as too limiting, excluding some of the most influential films of the genre, such as Psycho and Silence of the Lambs, and too vague, with other genres such as fantasy and fairy tale often including monstrous and otherworldly threats/characters. Carroll expands, however, saying the context of the monster is what differentiates the genre, with horror's monsters being extraordinary characters in ordinary worlds, whereas in fantasy and fairy tale, the monster is an ordinary character in an extraordinary world. Other theorists, like Clive Bloom and Stephen Prince, see horror as a genre defined by its conventions, tropes both visually and narratively repeated throughout the genre's stories. Bloom often relates this to the interlinked relationship between the Gothic and horror genres, stating how many of the elements we now think of as horror staples originated from Gothic literature, even down to the tendency towards intertextuality. This links back to Carroll's discussion of the two primary plot structures of horror narratives. Firstly, the discovery plot, where the protagonists must face off external threats hitherto unknown entering their space, and the overachiever plot, where a character pushes beyond, creating the threat of the narrative themselves, both of which can be seen in classic Gothic literature such as Dracula with the discovery plot, and Frankenstein with the overachiever plot. A common denominator in the discussions of horror is the importance of fear as the core emotion to the genre, with Bloom quoting H.P. Lovecraft saying, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear." While Prince discusses the longevity of horror's relevance is due to the fact that there is always something new for society to fear, which can be reflected in a given era's films and monsters. Although Carroll's monstrous definition may be reductive when looking at the genre as a whole, its applicability is much more relevant when looking at horror aimed at children, with supernatural nature of monstrous threats being palatable to younger audiences, since the threat is inherently unreal. For something to be seen as monstrous, it must break our existing sense and understanding of reality. The most common scene digression committed by monsters of horror is the subversion of the hierarchy of life and death, with many different forms of the undead being commonplace. Our screens are filled with various depictions of the living dead, from zombies and skeletons to ghosts and vampires. This upheaval of the basic law of existence is a source of great distress. Monstrous forms are historically charged with commentary on the society they originate from. Otherness has been a source of fear throughout history, with people transforming what is unknown to them or not part of their insular ideals into horrifying monsters that reinforce those beliefs within society. This correlation between the other and the monster has in turn led to those who do not fit in society's ideal boxes to find comfort in these monsters, which is reflected further in children's horror, with the more traditionally monstrous characters ending up not as they seem. Monsters play a vital role in children's development, starting as a way to excite developing imaginations with a healthy diet of make-believe. Fairy tales and stories like the Gruffalo, where the perceived monsters are no real threat but a source of delight to their audiences. As children develop, the monster becomes a way to face their fears, building up a confidence and understanding of the world in the safe arms of fiction. How you turn a genre that is inherently adult into something appropriate for children is a tricky subject, as much of what defines horror goes directly against BBFC's guidelines for films suitable for younger audiences. The portrayal of danger, threat, and violence are the most obvious ones to mention. The way animated horror finds around this is the medium's inherent separation from reality, allowing for a blurring of the lines, so to speak, in what is and isn't appropriate for younger audiences, while also allowing characters to escape unscathed from exaggerated cartoon violence. The portrayal of the monster is also another way to alter horror for younger audiences. If you compare mainstream portrayals of monsters with their cartoon counterparts, the difference in designs and actions exemplifies the changes in target audiences, with the animated ones having less realistic and exaggerated appearances, whilst also being shown in a generally less threatening manner. The most prominent way horror is adapted for younger audiences is by emphasizing the play between horror and humor, as both genres rely on the same setup and payoff, with just different intended emotional effects. Scenes that would typically be distressing in live action, such as being hunted by hordes of walking corpses that can easily tear a character limb from limb in The Walking Dead, is played for laugh in animation, through the use of absurd visuals and music such as the party zombies from Gravity Falls, along with what could be seen as atypical reactions in the face of danger from young protagonists, such as...
Dipper, what's the one thing I asked you not to do tonight?
Raise the dead.
And what did you do?
Raise the dead.
As well as defeating zombies through terrible family karaoke. All of these techniques work together to keep the core principles and iconography of horror whilst also maintaining a sense of accessibility for younger audiences, without concerns of exposure to harmful materials. Part 2. Representing childhood. Representations of childhood in media are inherently tainted by the views of adults. A healthy mix of rose-tinted nostalgia and hyper-conscious ideas about how children should grow up paint a very specific version of childhood that no one truly lives. This contamination is unavoidable though, as all mass market media is created or influenced by adults in some way, meaning a true, authentic portrayal of childhood through a child's eyes is impossible. How this portrayal of childhood is handled, however, varies greatly when examined through the lens of different genres, due to the message and stories they wish to portray. Looking at animation as a whole, children are rarely in charge of their own stories. Only 17 of the 99 films, 89 of which are rated PG or under, nominated for Best Animated Feature since the category began in 2002, have human protagonists aged 13 or under. In every other instance, the protagonist is either an adult surrogate, a teenage progressing to adulthood, or some form of anthropomorphic non-human. This drought of audience peers seen in children's animation is unheard of in any other category of media. Much of this comes down to what is seen as appropriate actions for child characters to engage with, according to boards like the BBFC and MPAA, which are in charge of film classification, as the actions on screen will likely influence the audience's behaviour and understanding of the world. The view of childhood most commonly seen in children's media is heavily influenced by Disney's Victorian lens. As in their century-long reign as media giants, they have positioned themselves as the moral arbiters and highest authority on the topic of childhood. Disney's childhood, however, is heavily influenced by the white picket fences and moral values of Christian conservative corporate America, portraying the most mild-mannered, middle-of-the-road idealization of reality, so not to offend parents by making a statement of any kind. In most of these films, children are positioned as victims and/or motivators for the non-child protagonist. These innocent figures of pious ideals fall victim to violence if they stray from the path to grandma's house, set out for them by figures of authority within their lives. This path must be followed exactly if they wish to become a well-adjusted member of society. A well-known example of this is Finding Nemo, where the child's kidnapping through a defiance of parental orders is the inciting incident for the non-human adult protagonist of this children's film. The lesson these films teach children is they must conform and follow the rules without question to remain safe. This motif of straying from the path can be traced back to fairy and folk tales, which began as moral tales told to children to help them understand the dangers of the world, in a way that was easy to comprehend. If a young character isn't a victim, their whole story will centre around a progression out of childhood. A character may kick and scream to maintain their sense of wonder as much as they like, but they must accept that the only future afforded to them is to become an adult. This is seen in Sword in the Stone, The Lion King, and The Jungle Book. The ideas around childhood and its inherent innocence are relatively new. Childhood as we think of it now was initially a sign of privilege, as wealthy families could afford to send their children to school and play rather than work. Most conversations around childhood centre on this idea of innocence due to a lack of knowledge, and when the right time to bestow that knowledge upon them is. This conversation is constantly progressing, especially as children's physical worlds shrink and online ones grow with lackluster regulations. The fear of how outside influences might threaten innocence of children is greater than ever. Adult horror often portrays children who do not conform as antagonists. The trope of the demonic child is well trodden within these films. Willful, driven and knowledgeable children are seen as something to be feared, a threat to the status quo as they cannot easily be controlled. This is due to a subversion of the hierarchy of power between adult and child, breaking their ideas of how the world should work and threatening their way of life. If a child isn't the perpetrator of violence within adult horror, they are once again positioned as the victim. Their youth, innocence and vulnerability, as they couldn't possibly take care of themselves, are used to exemplify the brutality of the antagonist, as it is seen as one thing to kill an adult, but a whole different thing to kill a child. In contrast, children's horror focuses on the child characters and their experience of the world around them. There is a focus in these films on the gaining of knowledge and experience without it inherently leading as a progression towards adulthood, allowing these characters to grow sideways instead. All the traits that would typically lead a child towards an antagonistic role in any other media becomes heroic traits in children's horror. The supernatural abilities and alternative preferences that often denote monstrous children within adult horror often become a key tool in many protagonists' arsenal within this child-forward context. Both Norman from Paranorman and Kat from Wendell and Wild have powers that often other them from the communities at the start of the film, but are vital in saving the days at the end. Part 3. Empowerment. Animated children's horror's biggest impact is the way it empowers its audience. Children can not only see themselves within these characters, but also see their actions and internalize them. The protagonist in any given piece of media is the audience's guide. We align ourselves with them due to the experiencing the world of the narrative through their eyes. Our ability to relate to the protagonist greatly impacts how we interact with the story, especially at a younger age, which is why children's media with a main character that can be seen as peers to their audience has a greater impact on that audience. Adult characters are decentralized in animated children's horror, either not being present at all, woefully incapable of providing help, or in many cases actively acting as an antagonistic force within the story. The removal of reliable adults allows the child characters to interact with the plot without question of adult supervision or adult intervention from the audience. This active participation in the plot as an autonomous character is a large part of the appeal of this genre. Children get to see relatable characters who aren't sat on the sidelines of the story, and they can see characters like themselves in heroic roles. Unlike many other genres, children in animated horror are allowed to actively participate in the violence of the narrative, not only being subjected to the threat of violence towards themselves from the antagonist, but also engage similarly in morally necessary heroic violence to defend themselves and or others, due to the lack of adult figures to fight on their behalf. The unreality of animation helps with the dynamic of violence within these films, as there is no genuine realistic threat behind it, once again bending the rules of what can be shown to children, since the characters are made of clay and pixels. Characters can fall from great heights, experience car crashes, or get into a fight with construction equipment without suffering a single scratch. The depiction of actual harm to protagonists is rare, despite the prominence of threat and danger within these films. Part 4. In application. In Wendell and Wild, Kat is presented as a very willful, independent protagonist, who has been deemed a problem child by the system that has repeatedly failed to support and protect her. She has learned to always expect the worst and is haunted by her past, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. At the first chance, she others herself visually from the coven of well-meaning vultures that make up the other students of the RBC girls' school as a form of armour. Kat knows she will be seen as different no matter what, so she takes control of it, making an entrance with a modified uniform and a monstrous boot and box known as the Cyclops, blasting "I am a poser" by X-ray specs, which has lyrics like, I like to make people stare and shock horror no escape, reinforcing Kat's actions in taking control of others' perceptions of her, so the impact she makes is on her terms and not theirs. Throughout the film, adults are shown to be untrustworthy, with those wishing to help keeping secrets from her, which leads to further danger. Sister Helly hides what she knows about Kat's role as a Hellmaiden from her, which directly leads to her unknowingly making a Faustian bargain for her parents' resurrection with her personal demons, or their only interest is how to exploit her for their own gain, with Father Best only interested in the Break the Cycle program being the money it can bring in for the school, instead of helping the children involved getting a second chance. Kat is the main driving force within the film. Her actions and choices directly move the plot forward, rather than just being carried from set piece to set piece. When she's manipulated into summoning demons over the guilt of her parents' death, she takes ownership of this mistake, stating, "My demons, my problem," and having to be the one to face her inner demons before she has the power to fight the ones in the real world. As the film progresses, she sees the community she grew up in being torn apart by corporate greed, eventually rallying the people to work together to stand up against the antagonist's plan to demolish her hometown and fight back. Despite her fear and premonitions telling her it's hopeless, she continues to stand her ground. Wendell and Wild uses a variety of the techniques discussed to make its horror appropriate and accessible for younger audiences. The demons are presented as comedic and incompetent in their attempts to be threatening, they themselves getting manipulated by the human antagonist and are eventually brought onto the protagonist's side for the final confrontation. The walking corpses of the Old Guard are quite literally dressed up in silly hats and are a spout of physical comedy throughout the film, with the threat they pose ending up being more idealistic than physical, with them generally falling apart with the tiniest bit of a nudge. Gravity Falls takes an interesting approach with the positioning of its twin child protagonists, with Dipper constantly trying to grow up too fast, while Mabel holds on to a wish of eternal childhood. Throughout the show, it is exemplified that neither of these ideals are a good position to be in, and that you will grow up how and when you are meant to. The twins' conflicting ideas on growing up comes to a head in the Season 2 episode Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future, where the dashing of Mabel's hopes and dreams about an idealized version of their teenage years leaves her distraught and spiraling, whilst Dipper is given the option to become Ford's apprentice, getting everything he ever wanted, but he would have to leave Mabel behind to do so. This leads to the show's main antagonist manipulating Mabel by promising her an endless summer, leading directly to the show's apocalyptic finale. In a later episode, Mabel has to directly confront the problems with an eternal childhood, as the prison she finds herself in caters to her every desire, which is much less fun in reality than imagined. Dipper, on the other hand, has to come to terms with not being ready. He still has a lot of growing up to do before he can get what he really wants. Exemplified through the series with his crush on an older teenage co-worker, who in reality sees him as a little kid. Gravity Falls uses a lot of intertextuality in its horror, constantly referring to the horror that came before it, with Season 1 Episode 5, The Inconveniencing, parodying many classic haunted house films, with characters being punished or possessed for perceived slights by the disgruntled dead. The show heavily relies on humour as its way to cut the tension, with an episode's antagonist often being defeated in unconventional and comedic ways, with the ghost in The Inconveniencing being exorcised by Dipper doing a ridiculous song and dance. However, this doesn't mean the show doesn't have its moments of being truly horrifying, as Hirsch liked to push what could and couldn't be shown, most famously in the episode Northwest Mansion Mystery. Horrifying. Part 5. Conclusion. Horror's status as a non-conventional genre that famously doesn't conform to societal expectations allows for the stories it tells to subvert those same expectations, empowering people who, in most other circumstances, are presented as victims, pushing boundaries that other more closely monitored genres cannot. A carefully choreographed dance of the line is needed by filmmakers to be able to tell the stories that only horror can, whilst also appeasing rating boards and families so the intended audiences can actually watch them. Animated children's horror may temper many of the genre's aspects in the eyes of purists, disqualifying itself as truly horror, but all these properties are made with genuine love and reverence for the genre. It keeps the spirit alive whilst, well, maybe removing a few of the sharper edges. This allows it to reach those who need it most. Children's love of these animated horror properties comes down to the fact that they don't coddle them like many other genres do. It puts people they can best relate to front and centre within the action. It sees these characters not only face fears relatable to its target audience, but also defeat them head-on without an adult's intervention, despite any fear they feel themselves, showing the audience that they can be their own heroes, stand up for what they believe in, whilst also remaining authentically themselves. These films focus on characters not changing for the world around them, but making the world accept them for who they are. They are not broken for being different, but powerful. By placing child characters in the driving seat, you can speak directly to the child watching, and they will internalize that message because what's more empowering than seeing someone like you defeat the monster?